Welcome, hi. I was going to say your names as you arrived, but you're coming too thick and fast. So welcome one and all. Please feel free to say hi in the chat. Tell us where on planet Earth you're joining from, how much participatory grant making you've done, if there's anything you particularly want to get out of this session, what your favorite chocolate bar is, anything you might want us to know about you in the chat. We'd love to hear it. Great. I'm Natasha and I'm one of the volunteers at the Participatory Grantmaking Community of Practice, and we've got 3 brilliant speakers lined up for you today, and I'm imagining there's lots of people with questions about how to get going on participatory grantmaking, so I'm aiming to leave loads of time at the end for us to be able to have a bit of a chat and get a bit more involved. But Elena is also here helping along. So if you have questions as you go along, or links you want shared with you, or links you want to share back at everyone else, please do drop them in the chat. We're recording this session because we'll share it on the Participatory Grantmaking Community of Practice YouTube channel. So if you're here incognito or aren't happy with your backdrop or anything of that, you don't want to be in our film basically, then feel free to switch your camera off or change your name. Be here and arrive in any way that feels right for you. So welcome to the session. Before we get going, in case you haven't joined a Participatory Grantmaking Community of Practice session before, I'll just let you know a tiny bit about the community. As you can see from our lovely animated slide, the Community of Practice has recently turned 3 years old. I think we're 3 years and 2 months old. We started as a group of 12 Participatory Grantmaking practitioners in March 2022, and it's now grown to, I think, 1,700, but Elena will update me. There's loads of you basically, and it's brilliant. Some of the things we run are monthly sessions in different time zones around the world where you can join and get peer-to-peer support. We usually run a monthly deep dive. This is one of them, where we look at a particular topic around participatory grant making in closer detail. We're starting to do some face-to-face joint meetings, and yeah, there's lots going on. We have a website, we have a YouTube channel that is full of so much content. So if you have a participatory grant making question, I would really suggest having a dig in through those, because there's loads of content there. The community has 4 values. They are that we believe in self-determination. We are rooted in values of anti-oppression and equity. We value accountability and transparency, and we move with care, love, and joy. And I bring those here because of the generous practitioners that are sharing their time with us today and sharing them with you all, so that we can all learn together about participatory grant making, and that we do that in an anti-extractive way, but also with joy. So if you feel like it, tell us what's bringing you joy within your practice at the moment in the chat. I think it's really important that we're not too serious about participatory grant making all the time. We also make some time for joy within it. Here are some links, which at this point, Elena very helpfully usually puts into the chat, so that if you want to come and join the website, join the Google group or the Slack channel, they are there for you. And we have a LinkedIn and a very active Twitter and a very active Google group talking about all manner of things in that Google group. The community is nearly entirely run by volunteers and people that are giving their time to it. You're very welcome to come and get involved in supporting some of that. But also in return, we hope that you get lots of learning, a community that enhances your solidarity and joy in this work, and that you feel part of something at the times when sometimes this work is a little bit frustrating. And with that, I will hand over to our first speaker, Zach. Hi, Zach. We haven't had a chance to speak today, but it's nice to see your face. Zach is from the Vermont Foodbank, and he's going to chat about how they got started with participatory grant making.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you too, Natasha. Thanks for letting me in as Andrea, which is the person I share a Zoom account with. I'm here to talk about the Vermont Foodbank's work in participatory grant making, and I will just preface by saying that we've been on this journey for a few years now. We've made some strides and have learned a lot of lessons along the way, but even just from looking at the chat, a lot of you also seem to be equally as far or further in your own journey. So hopefully this will be a good inspiration for those of you just getting started of what it can look like and what the timeline can feel like. So go ahead and move to the next slide for me, please. So the Vermont Food Bank is the largest hunger relief organization in the state of Vermont in the United States. And we do our work in a variety of ways. One of the main ways we do it is through partnership with over 300 network partners, either food pantries, meal sites, school pantries, local organizations doing the work on the ground of charitable food distribution. And we were established in 1986, and we also do our own food distribution and a lot of food rescue from organizations across the state. We were established in 1986, and to be honest with you, we've, as an organization, primarily focused on sort of traditional food distribution, what you would think of for a traditional food bank or food pantry, up until the pandemic in 2020. And since then, we've done a lot of work to really reconceptualize what anti-hunger work can look like and what it looks like to do authentic community engagement throughout the state. And that's where our participatory grant making has really sort of grown from and had space to take root in, is the values and practices we've developed since then. So the mission of the Vermont Food Bank is to gather and share quality food and nurture partnerships so that no one in Vermont will go hungry. And on the right-hand side, you'll see our sort of strategic vision for the next 5 years. We have 3 buckets that we do our work in. And the one that I've made the largest in the center there, collaborate with communities to improve food access and well-being, is where our grant making falls squarely into, and really is a new framework for the food bank. You know, we're not a foundation. We are really learning, mostly through this group, honestly, how to do grant making and how to do it intentionally and really stretch ourselves as an organization in that way. And this journey has been a new edge for us in terms of how do we really show up for communities and do it in a way that still solves anti-hunger work throughout the state. So one of the, I think, nice learnings and lessons that the food bank can hopefully offer to folks who might even be further along in their own participatory grant making journey is we've put a lot of internal work and effort into our core values as an organization, and we really do try to use those as the basis for the grant making that we're doing now. So I know there's a lot of text, but I do feel like it's important because we've put a lot of time into crafting it. So at the Vermont Food Bank, we believe that anti-hunger work is only possible with a commitment to removing barriers caused by systems of oppression that perpetuate hunger and poverty. We recognize that systemic injustice and bias disproportionately impact some identities more than others. Vermont Food Bank is actively working to center equity and the fair treatment of all people in everything we do, so that everyone in Vermont has access to nourishing food that reflects and values cultural differences. To that end, we commit to listening and supporting solutions to hunger that are sourced from people and communities with lived or living experience of hunger and poverty, and to responding where inequity exists. We also commit to taking great care to cultivate internal culture and practices that support diversity, inclusion, and shared power. That came from a group at the food bank called our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Resource Team, DIRT for short. That's our acronym that we refer to ourselves by. And that group has been doing, fundamental but sort of behind the scenes work to help create culture within our organization for years now, and has gotten us to a point where we're doing, all staff trainings on a monthly basis, where we're hosting similar to this group, deeper dives on a regular basis to engage in topics that might be a stretch or a learning zone for our staff. And it wouldn't be without that group and without these core values as our foundation that any of our other work that I'm going to talk about would have happened. So now to get more specific, the grant that I manage at the food bank and the one that we've been growing into in terms of participatory grant making is what we call our capacity fund. And that fund is an opportunity for organizations to try to eliminate hunger in their community by transforming their organizational capacity. And we recognize in anti-hunger work and as a food bank that there's always ongoing need and constant folks who need food today and tomorrow, and that's an urgent request. We also have to keep an eye on the bigger picture and on the systems that impact that work and how we can make that transformation happen in the long term. So this grant really was designed to try and accomplish both of those by increasing organizational capacity, fostering new relationships with organizations and with the community, cultivating sustainable or community-driven programming, and dismantling structural barriers to food security. It's a lofty goal. I would say we definitely touch on pieces of all of them, but don't accomplish any of them fully. And that's part of the learning edge that we've gone through over the past 3 years or so. So the looks like the formatting got a little crunched here, but what you're seeing is a text version of the scoring rubric that we use. And the scoring rubric directly reflects the application that we ask from folks during our grant making process. In each of these bolded headers is a category of what we're looking for in our priorities and what we're trying to focus on from partners. So I won't read all the text. I'll just point out the headers, which are resilient solutions to solving hunger, increasing organizational capacity, deepening organizational equity and engagement, fostering meaningful relationships in your community, taking a collaborative approach, prioritizing community-driven solutions, repairing systemic harm, and ensuring equitable food access for all. And that last bullet particularly is how can the Vermont Food Bank stretch what we think of as our traditional charitable food network, and how can we prioritize partnerships with Black, Indigenous, or people of color organizations who are historically under-resourced, and how can we allow the network that we have, the access to donors that we have, transfer to some folks who might not have as big of a spotlight in the state. And the text really quickly that is bold and underlined there, those words pretty much directly overlap from that statement I shared earlier from the diversity, equity, and resource team, and the other document, which was much longer, which outlined our values as an organization. So there's a direct overlap between all of that key work that went in for years to craft those in the way we've worked to prioritize that within our grant making program. So just really quickly to maybe inspire you, if you're just starting in grant making, see our timeline and see how that has reflected our growth over the past few years. So like I said, the fund started in 2020, really as an emergency, urgent response to a crisis, a food crisis happening in the state. And in that instance, we had never really done grant making in this way before. We just knew that we needed to resource our communities. So we sort of scrambled and decided on a funding amount and took our whole network partner list of over 300 partners and just used an incredibly simple formula based on the pounds of food that they'd received last year and distributed a check immediately to those folks. It was a very equal approach. I would not say it was an especially equitable or impactful approach. It helped, move quickly, and it helped a lot of partners sort of bail out the sinking ship, but it wasn't designed in an intentional way, and it didn't accomplish the values that we were really aiming for as an organization. And so luckily that growth sort of allowed us to realize we had to start thinking about things more intentionally. That led to the COVID-19 Special Relief Fund, which was the first time that we named helping organizations go from what they're hearing in the community and transforming that into their work in a sustainable way. So what does it look like? What are you hearing? What's happening in this time of crisis? And you have, a lot of community-based learning. What can we do to help support that? And then the two after that, the green columns, 2022 and 2023, again, has been a process of iteration and constant learning. And that's where we currently find ourselves. We're actually in the middle of our two grant rounds for the 2023 cycle, and are always trying to grow and learn how we can make this a more iterative process and how we can listen more deeply to our community. 2023 also is the year that we are doing stakeholder engagement and really doing deep interviews with the folks who have received funds in the past to hear what would work for them, hear what model they might be interested in, and if they're interested in actually participating in a participatory model for 2024. So things that have gone well for us so far. We've distributed just over 1.6 million, sorry, I forgot my numbers there, $1.6 million to partners throughout the state. Around 90 partners have received funding, and they're that allows them to have a direct impact on their local community in a way that the food bank, as a traditional food distribution organization, has never been able to have a ripple impact in the same way. We've also had a couple of years to streamline internal process, and we always do a pretty intensive feedback process at the end of the grant cycle. And for 2 years now, we've heard really positive feedback around making an accessible grant application for partners, which feels like a minimal lift and feels much more accessible for our partners, who are often just small volunteer-run organizations, to take on, and isn't as burdensome as some other grants that they apply for. It's also been a really good educational opportunity for our staff, and I think it's helped create a culture of organizational trust in moving into a full participatory model, where they have full decision-making autonomy in 2024. We've done it with a staff team. We've seen what that decision-making process can look like. We've gotten, our board and our CEO to recognize that those decisions and that process has to have trust endowed in it in order for it to be effective. And now we're ready to take the next step and do that with a full community panel. However, obviously, as all I think participatory grant making is, there's always iteration and learning, and we've had our fair share. So we're constantly trying to just tweak those funding priorities and make them align in the best way that we can, recognizing that we do have over 300 partners with a really wide need. So, what does equitable grant making look like for two partners, right? Looking at a traditional food pantry that's volunteer run, who is doing critical work of getting, hot meals out 4 days a week to the community, versus looking at a brand new, organization working to resource Black Vermonters doing farming and food systems work. And how do you put those two into the same grant program and decide which one is, quote unquote, more important to invest in? That's a really challenging process for our grant review team to have to hold those decisions. And that's part of the reason why we feel like we need to get more embedded in the community to help the community continue to shape the program and our priorities moving forward. We also have done a lot of work to streamline our internal finance systems. We've constantly pushed back on needing certain 501c requirements, tax requirements, and how can we do it so that we're investing more in the small grassroots level and removing some of that bureaucracy in terms of who we can support. And I think most importantly, we've continued to try to build capacity so that folks who are funding can then show up as stakeholders in the participatory grant making process. And we can have staff capacity to fully invest in those relationships once the funding goes out the door. And it's not just a transaction, but it's actually a first step in key relationship building. that, that takes a lot of work. And we, this point, it's only me facilitating this grant, and I don't even do it year round. I have other work that I'm holding. So we're learning as an organization that we either need to bring in more staff capacity, or we need to find creative ways to empower the folks who are part of the grant making to also help us with that process. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Zach. It's so interesting to hear. And I think there's probably lots of people on this call that can empathise with your problem of being the lone person working on a stream of funding. It's a challenge that I think a lot of people have. But what's really interesting about what you're doing is I love that participatory grant making exists outside of a foundation, and that it could possibly live and breathe somewhere else. Is so interesting. Ben, we've noted your question. Thank you so much for asking that. I'm hoping that we'll get time to get to them at the end. So stay tuned, Ben. Next, I want to introduce Sangeeta Bhattacharya from the Rebuild India Fund, who's going to talk about how she's developed participatory grant making there.
Thanks, Natasha. Great to be here. And I think as I was just listening to Zach, there are already so many things that resonated. So really good to be here. And I think we are always on the lookout, like I think Zach also mentioned, to learn from people who are attempting, I think, different aspects of this. So yeah, really great to be here. So I thought before I jump into some of the specifics on what we are doing with participatory grant making, I thought I'll share a quick overview of what is the fund about, what the objectives are, because then it ties into some of the processes that we have built where PGM is kind of playing a big role, right? So to start with, Rebuild India Fund was actually launched as a COVID relief initiative back in 2021, when in India we saw that was the year of the second wave, which saw many more preventable deaths, saw a lot more happening with some of the most vulnerable and marginalized communities, right? And I think a harsh learning for a lot of people who have been operating in the sector for a very long time was just how less supported some of the most frontline and grassroots organizations are, right? And again, at Dasra also as an organization that we have worked with some of the leading nonprofits in the sector for the longest time, we also realized there is this whole host of organizations that have been kind of left out from this whole ecosystem for many reasons, right? Not one, many reasons. So keeping that aspect in mind, Dasra and Bhattacharya Foundation, who is sort of our anchor funder for this fund, we expanded the scope of the Relief Initiative to become this platform, which is the Rebuild India Fund, which will look at supporting some of the most grassroots organizations and help them with unrestricted funding and capacity building support for a period of 5 years, right? And we are looking at this initiative to, from at least a 5 to 10 years point of view. So we are hoping that over 10 years, we are able to support 100 such groups with some of these kinds of support that I just discussed. And as we were building this out, really, there were sort of 4 big cornerstones for us that we really want to do as part of this fund. And that's what you kind of see on the slide. The first thing is really supporting the most proximate and the most community-rooted organizations, right? And in this one, I think again, as an organization, we went through some processes, we went through some iterations to really identify again what is grassroots, right? Means different things to different people, and one may not define it in the same context for everybody. So what we are seeing as for this fund, for us, the proximate leaders are those who have lived experiences of the communities that the organization serves, right? So we are identifying, the idea is to identify 100 such organizations led by such leaders every year. And therefore, beyond the leadership, how community rooted the organization is also something that we want to gauge and therefore support such organizations, right? So that is kind of honestly the driving force of this fund, and that's what you see in the first piece. The second bit is where we are really, again, I think, picking on some of the things that also Zach said, right? Being more intentional about how do we transfer power and decision making to the implementers. Now, again, as an organization, we had done grant making in the past. We had also done collaboratives in the past, right? But again, some of the learnings that we took from the kind of communities that we work with as part of the relief initiative, I think what became clearer is that there is scope for us to be more formal about making those decision-making powers lie with the communities that we serve. And again, as an organization, how do we push ourselves, right, to really be accountable towards that? So that's kind of the second principle that we kind of embodied, that we're trying to operationalize as part of this plan. The third thing is really facilitating need-based and contextual capacity building for these NGOs, right? Now, that's again, the whole idea is that, and again, in a country like India, where context differs so quickly, you move from one geography to the other, your needs, the kind of issues the community faces, and therefore the kind of challenges that you as an organization will face also change, right? So just being cognizant of that, how do we really rebuild as a platform, which looks at not only Dasra, but other support providers also who can extend the kind of support that's again coming from a place of the needs of the community and the leaders, right? So that is kind of the third big piece. And finally, I think, how do we really foster a local community of philanthropists supporting such nonprofits? And how do we really enable this whole trust-based philanthropy as a movement, right? That is our bigger goal. So in a way, Dasra is one organization through this fund. Even if we support like 1,000 organizations, there'll be a lot more that we won't be able to do, right? But our larger hope is, can we serve as proof of concept for other funders, for other foundations to adopt this and do this in their own, right? And in that, one of the biggest shift that we would want to see, which will be the success of this fund, if you are able to break away from this power dynamic, right, between a grantor and the grantee, that how do you really lead from a place of trust? How do you lead from a place of, we are all in this for the community. So keeping the communities front and center. So that's kind of why we launched this fund and what we are trying to do. We can go to the next. And in that, like I said, that because a lot of what we want to do is dependent on who is the portfolio, right? So how are we identifying this portfolio is a critical milestone that way for us. And in that, the methodology that is guiding all of this, right, is rooted in gender, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So JEDI is what we call it. That's kind of guiding everything that we're doing. And the reason we try to, again, bring this in the form of a framework is that while a lot of us may want to, again, do EI in different ways, right? But the idea is that what does it really mean for a function like this, right? So we've tried to break it down into a process, a few steps that we are following as part of the process. The first thing is recognizing that there are barriers, and that barriers are not, it's not being equal, right? So there are barriers to participation, there is barriers to access, right? So while, again, like I said, that in India, you're talking about a lot, the NGO sector is quite big, right? However, within that large space, there is a certain percentage whose barriers are more than the others, right? So firstly, acknowledging and recognizing that is kind of the first thing that we are doing, right? The second thing that we are really doing is that through this process, how do we enable the whole sourcing of portfolio to happen in a way that is representative of the reach, right? And what I mean by that is, how do we really look at identifying such leaders, not only from one platform, but democratize the process, right? So therefore, in our case, for example, when we look at sourcing for this fund, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, we are looking at a lot of nodal partners, for example, right, who are spread across the country, who are working with different kinds of communities, which makes sure that the list that we kind of start with, the sample that we start with, is an indicative and inclusive list, right? So that is, again, making sure that JEDI is kind of, it's driven by JEDI. I think the third very big thing, a shift for us, again, rather, has been that how do we really understand the context of these communities, right? Because we are saying that we want to, again, look at some of the most vulnerable communities. But it's very difficult to be objective about understanding one kind of vulnerability over here, right? And it's not fair to say that one is sort of more important or less important than the other. So we are really bringing in a lens of intersectionality, right? So it's not enough about understanding who the group is. We try to understand the context of what has been the reason, what is sort of the socio-economic drivers for this community, right? What is the political and institutional sort of angle that has either helped or not helped these communities from past so many years, right? What is the level of agency that these communities have beyond the interventions of the organization, right, or the ancient one? And finally, also understanding by way of location, by way of climate, because that is kind of influencing everything. has that been a factor in either increasing or decreasing the vulnerabilities of this community? And along with that, cutting across all of this, is this a gender angle? Is there a caste angle, right? Is there a religion? Any other social factor which may lead to different levels of vulnerability for a group? So that becomes very important to us in understanding the degree of vulnerability that the community kind of faces. And finally, how do we bring all of this together? Because at the end of the day, we have to make objective decisions. How do we bring all of this together in a framework that is rooted in logic? So we rank and score these organizations, after taking them through all of these parameters. That helps us assess where in the spectrum the organization falls, and that's kind of what we take as a recommendation to our selection. Right? So this methodology is extremely important for us because before we are even reaching the selection phase, we are trying to ensure to the extent possible through the process that we are adopting, it is participative, it is inclusive of different kinds of voices, and it's taking into account all the different contexts and challenges that the community faces. Right? Now, finally, on the next. Is I think how we have devised the process itself. So here, if you see right from sourcing to this selection by the investment committee, right? Like I said, this is the spectrum of participation for us, and this is how we are adopting one spectrum of PGM into this fund, which is to say that the way when we look at sourcing, like I said, that how do we democratize the process, and we are doing it through a set of these modal partners that we are reaching, right? And in that also, I think when I look back at the launch of the fund, which was about a year and a half back, between the 1.5 years, we already have interacted with 7 to 8 such groups who work with phenomenal kinds of communities and have a great spread across the country, right? However, we are currently at around 76 organizations, which only means that there are that many more that is left to be discovered, right? So these modal partners are in a way one of the most critical first steps for us to make sure that, again, we are reaching out to as many different kinds of groups as possible who are serving different kinds of vulnerabilities, right? So that's kind of the step one. Eligibility, I'm not going to get to the detail of, because that just makes sure that our paperwork and everything is in place. So that's like the bare minimum that we need in terms of compliance from these organizations. I think the third piece on, once we have this set of recommendations, right, that how are we really doing the process of assessment, is also where we have tried to be as participatory as possible. So the first thing that we are doing is just in terms of the parameters, right? We look at 3, like I said, very overarching, non-intrusive parameters, which really helps us understand the organization, right? So again, this is not coming from a place of question, it's coming more from a place of help us understand what we do, right? So we are really looking at leadership, like I said, that what is the lived experience that the leader or the leadership or the organization has. Beyond lived experiences, are the other members in the leadership also coming from any neglected or marginalized backgrounds? So really understanding that aspect of the leadership, right? That's the first thing that we look at. The second thing that we get into is really understanding what is the community centricity of the organization, right? And what this means is, by way of their model, by way of how they work with the communities, we want to understand, are they really enabling the communities to deliver change, right? Or are they looking at the communities being, for example, stakeholders in certain parts of their process, right? So this gives us a sense of, again, while this is also a spectrum, you could be very low in your community centricity, or you could be very high. It just helps us understand where this organization kind of falls, right? And finally, vulnerability, like I just discussed, understanding the type and the degree of vulnerability. So once we kind of understand this from the organization, we do not need a separate proposal. We do not need anything else from the organization. Again, the idea was that if we want to push others to adopt such practices, what is the change that we can start with, right? And this seemed like one thing that we can definitely change, that given this is unrestricted funding, given this is flexible funding, we really need a proposal from the organization. So there is nothing that's asked from the organization beyond this conversation that is about 1.5 to 2 hours of a conversation that happens over Zoom. And beyond this, it's just the documents, like I said, which is more around their compliance that we ask. So that's in terms of process, we are trying to ensure that it's as NGO friendly as possible. It's as less cumbersome from them as possible, because proposal writing is in itself a beast to deal with, right? And I think the final part where this is again the angle of PGM comes big for us is the investment committees, right? So Dasra, as a team that is collating this cohort, we are taking this as a recommendation to the investment. And the investment committee is actually the body that is deciding who gets to be part of the portfolio, right? So the sign off and the decision is not with the Dasra team, it is with the investment committee. Now, while I'll of course share some of this in detail over writing in terms of who the people are, I did want to spend a few minutes on just discussing how did we look at these 5 profiles, right? And who are really some of the people. So it's a 5-member team. They are extremely representative of the Indian civil society landscape. 3 self-identify as females and 2 are males. And so it's a mix of established as well as emerging folks, right? So to give you a sense, one of them is, for example, comes with more than 2 decades of experience in gender and is working to make sure that within our formal and informal workplaces, how do we enable gender inclusion, right? One of them comes with, is a social reformer who comes from one of the most neglected communities in India and has led an organization who is trying to work across different places, right? So has the lived experience herself. One of them is leading a national collaborative who works with, again, different social entrepreneurs to achieve the SDGs, right? So that way has a very strong understanding of the different kind of organizations, networks, collaboratives in the country and comes in with that, right? One of them is somebody who has a lot of experience developing youth leadership, across different communities and geographies in India, and has looked at mainstreaming agriculture as a livelihood option, right? Because given the significance of agriculture in a country like India is huge. And finally, we have somebody who is leading the partnerships for an organization that has defined disaster and relief management in India. So when you look at these 5 people and the different perspectives they bring in, it ensures that it's a very rich portfolio. It's an extremely inclusive portfolio. And it's a portfolio, again, that is representative of what we want to do, right? So that's kind of what's really bringing it home for us in terms of the process and where we are at in terms of participatory granting. What we want to do more of, and we are very in a nascent stage, is what happens after the organization is part of the portfolio, everything that's happening post-granting, right? In terms of how do we make sure that the voices of the organization is coming into us designing the capacity building support, right? How do we really even measure impact? So those are also aspects where we have kickstarted conversations with the portfolio members, because again, the messaging and our own sort of hope is that is also something that we co-create with them. Nothing that we want to do in this fund wants to come from a place of like we want to be very prescriptive, right? So that's kind of where we are at in our journey. We will also, I'm sure we'll make a lot of mistakes, but the whole idea is that we are acknowledging it. We are learning with everybody in the space. So yeah, just going to move on.
Thank you, Sangeeta. It's so interesting, and so I really love everything you say about that. As a foundation on your own, you can't do it all. You've got to influence the sector to be funding differently. I'd love to chat more. Hopefully, we'll have time at the end about how you're doing that. But next is Shewring, who is very close to where I am in London. She's part of the Cripplegate Foundation, which also manifests as Islington Giving, but I imagine you'll explain that better than I can. Anne, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Natasha. Thank you, everyone. Lovely to be here. So I'm in London, and I'm going to go back a step and just talk a little bit about how we went on the journey, which was quite a long journey of convincing our very traditional foundation to let people our residents make decisions about the money that we give out. And just for context, when we talk about PGM, it's about resident-led giving. So we give residents with a variety of lived experience lumps of money. They design the grant call based on their experience of local need and the way that they have used services. They then assess the applications they receive, they meet some of the applicant groups, and then they decide who gets the money. But we haven't always done this. Cripplegate Foundation is a 500-year-old endowed foundation. And most of you will know that means that we invest money and then we give away the proceeds of those investments. We were started in one a single parish in London, central London. 500 years ago, somebody left £40 in their will to buy trousers for the local people of that parish, which was called Cripplegate, which is why we have this very odd and unfortunate name, which we don't seem to be able to change. But that's why we call the Cripplegate Foundation, because we were in the parish of Cripplegate, which is a gate in the old London, City of London. So we're all very Dick Whittington. It's all about the history. And basically for 500 years, all our decisions were made by white men in oil painting. So if you think of, you know, the years and years of people, we still have some of these paintings in our storeroom. They made decisions over very fancy dinners. We had special Cripplegate chairs that they sat in while they made these decisions. We still have all the branded crockery from those days. There's a bunch of silver plate in one of the original churches, which we may or may not own. We're still battling for that because we'd like to sell it if we do. We've got leather-bound books of minutes from meetings from hundreds of years ago. So it's all pretty interesting stuff. And there is a sort of fun craziness to being part of something so old. But as I think we're learning across the UK, stuff from the olden days is not necessarily a 21st century model for anything, really. So rather than starting with a blank slate, our slate was really, really full. And it was full of history, and it was full of the ways things have been done before, and we had to change that. And I'd say we'd started about 20 years ago when we got a new director, a woman, which was sensational news for us 20 years ago. And we had already expanded our grant giving beyond this one single parish into one London borough called Islington. So like most of London, Islington is a really great place to live, but only really if you have resources or family or community or an ability to access all the opportunities, because it's also massively unequal. And these days, no regular person can afford to buy or really rent there anymore. The infrastructure is crumbling. We have the least amount of green space in London, and child poverty is just huge. So there's real need in our one London borough. And in 2020, we commissioned a piece of research called Invisible Islington, which aimed to try and bring this kind of inequality to light for people. So people kind of know it in somewhere, but what we tried to do was talk to people about their neighbours. So you may be living in one square, which is really beautiful, but literally down the road will be somebody who is living in a really difficult situation. And we wanted to talk about that more. And one of the results of that was that we realised we needed to do more, that the money we were getting for our Cripplegate endowment, it wasn't going to be enough. So we started Islington Giving. So Islington Giving is a coalition of funders who agreed to sort of test this model where they would put their money into a central pot of funds, which we would then distribute in the borough. Residents could also give money, as could local businesses, and we would use our expertise and our knowledge of the borough to try and get that money to the best and most needed places. It's now a very common model, certainly in London, and I'm sure other places. And but you know, I'm just going to tell Natasha we were the first. She knows that. But part of the rationale for Islington Giving was because we had the idea that everybody had something to give and could be part of this process. So whether that was time or money. But I don't think 13 years ago we were really thinking so much about residents helping us to give out our money. So that was something that has come more gradually. And although 13 years doesn't seem that long ago, I think in grant giving terms, it is quite a long time ago. It feels a bit of a different world to me. It feels like we've come quite a long way quite quickly. Certainly our first resident-led decision-making panel was 6 years ago, and this was what our Young Grantmakers programme. And this came out of a bit of work we did asking young people what they would like to see happen in the borough. And they said quite a lot, but two things in particular. So one was they wanted to be more involved in decision making, and the second was to have real world job experience. So our solution to that was to employ young people to make decisions on the work that we should be funding for other young people in the borough. And that was the kind of birth of Young Grantmakers, which we've now done for 5 years since then. So although times have changed and we were better than we had been some 20 years ago, and we had some new trustees, we still have quite a lot of echoes on our board of those old white guys in the paintings. And as I said, I think things have changed quite a lot in those 13 years. And I think there was still quite a residual feeling that really only the people around the table could make those decisions, and that there was a sense of risk about handing that over to someone else. We had to convince our trustees basically that other people were perfectly capable of making these decisions. And we took a bit of a multi-pronged approach to this. So I think firstly, we started with young people. And I think for our trustees who were not young people, mostly older people, there was a sense that we don't understand young people, so we do need them to make the decisions. And I think in a way that was really helpful. I think if we'd started with a group of people that looked like our trustees or were the same age as our trustees, we would have had more pushback, like, well, why are they're like, why are they doing it? We can do it. But there's a sort of a feeling, well, you know, we don't understand young people, so it's fine to ask them to make these decisions. And I don't really agree with that, but I think it was helpful in getting that first panel off the ground, really. I think there was also something about, because it was it had two objectives, and the second was about employment and training. So some of our trustees were very much on board with, yes, we're giving young people an opportunity to get work experience, and that has to be a good thing. So in a way, for some of them, we could sort of smother the decision-making bit with this is a great job opportunity and work experience, and you know, who wouldn't get behind that? So that kind of improving dimension for some of our older trustees was quite good, quite helpful. And I think because we did this through Islington Giving rather than Cripplegate, and it's a bit of a confusing, as Natasha pointed out, a bit of a confusing difference, but because the money we raise from Islington Giving is income coming in, so it comes from other funders, it comes from residents, it's not part of our endowment, I think our trustees felt less concerned about it. They weren't giving residents the power to make decisions over this precious endowment. Of course, it doesn't make any difference. It's all income. Residents don't care where it comes from. But I think there was something a bit residual for our board about it's our responsibility to manage how we use the endowment. But this other money we're raising that's a bit more in and out, that's fine. We can risk that. That'll be okay. I think those three things made the argument more helpful. We also had to convince some of our other stakeholders. So we're a place-based local funder, and we know a lot of the organisations that we fund. We've known them for years. Some of them we funded for a long time. So they also have a huge stake in if we change how we make decisions, because some of those groups won't get funded. Lots of them will, some new groups will, but some of them probably won't. And so I think there is a conversation to be had about with the groups that you're funding to bring them on board as well. The process is a bit different. They have to, they have to approach it slightly differently, I think, than they would a traditional board. So for our first Young Grantmakers, we commissioned a local youth organisation to run the first year's programme. And I think that was really helpful because it both helped us to think about how we should go about things, but it also showed other local groups that we were open to their ideas and their thoughts. And we also based the model on previously kind of well-tested approach. Some of you will know the Youth Bank International model, where young people raise money as well as spend it. And that was quite well established in many parts of the world, although not really in the UK at the time. And we asked one of their long-time staff members to help us to deliver the first round. So that kind of sort of combination of local and national expertise was a really good blend, I think. And I think it helped convince our trustees that we knew what we were doing. I mean, obviously we didn't, but it helped convince them that we did. I think it was a key decision that we made was not to let our trustees have final approval of the decisions that residents were making. And that probably sounds obvious now, but at the time it really wasn't. Really what our trustees, I think, felt they wanted to do was let residents make some suggestions, and then they would kind of pour over them and amend and change. And we were really keen that that couldn't happen, because obviously, if you're asking people to make decisions, they need to make the decisions. They don't need to have them then ratified by another group of invisible people. But I do understand that for trustees have ultimate responsibility for where our money goes. And what we were asking them to do basically was hand over that decision making to people they'd never met before, who'd never done this before, and yet they were the people that were going to hold the risk for this. So it was really important that we came up with a process where the board couldn't start sort of nitpicking and overturning decisions, but they did feel included in the process and in the risk, I guess, in ways that they felt they could hold the risk. So the way we did it was to delegate, the board delegated the grant making authority to the programme director, which is me. So I'm responsible to the board for all the decisions our residents make. Fortunately, they've never made any bad decisions, so we're all good. But we also report all those grants back to the board, but the trustees can't overturn any of them. And to be honest, we've usually paid out the money by the time we get to report them back to the board. So their choices are a little bit limited, really. And we've never had a problem. So it hasn't been a problem. You know, residents make perfectly fine choices, as we all know. So it's never really been an issue. But it is about slightly reassuring, I think, a board who've not done this before. And then just a couple of other points. I think success and time are really important. So Young Grantmakers has been really successful. It's one of our flagship programs. And off the back of that model, we now run panels for all kinds of other residents, for parents, for older people, for carers. We have people helping us with our small grants programs, all kinds of things. But we wouldn't have been able to do anything like that, or it would have been much harder to have done that if Young Grantmakers hadn't been successful. So I think that kind of beds in, and actually then the trustees get ownership of that, and now they're rightly very proud of the programme. They talk about it all the time as if it was all their idea. They have lots of residents, they meet lots of residents, and you know, of course we all know, it turns out that they're smart, engaged, knowledgeable, just like the board is. And the other great thing is just time, and the great thing about time and people, frankly, as they move on. I think it would appear really odd to the trustees we now have, who are really a completely different set of trustees to that original group, to not be involving residents in decision making. I just don't think it would occur to them that that's something that we wouldn't do now, which is great. They see it as really essential to the way we deliver our work. We're a place-based funder. It would be absolutely ridiculous to not be asking the people in the place we work what we should be funding, and I don't really think that occurs to them. Our new strategy mandates us to share power and to do more of that, and I think the trustees have really bought into that for really good reasons. And you know, although I'm making like full marks to the original trustees who sort of decided to do this, because after 500 years it was a massive change, and you know, they took it on, and I think they helped us to develop a really good model that I feel is quite strong in the way that we work going forward. It's me.
Thanks, Anne, and thank you for being so transparent about how you've moved the board forward. I think it will bring hope to an awful lot of people that are trying to move a board on. I can see that questions are coming in the chat, but I thought we might just do some really quick fire top tips from Zach, Sangeeta, and Anne. I know you've got to go, Anne, at some point as well. Just what's your number one top tip for participatory grant making, getting it going, Zach?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for us, it really comes back to having that foundation, right? Especially as not being a traditional grant making foundation, like we needed that foundation of values. We needed that base to lean into. Otherwise, we're just making arbitrary decisions. So work on that first is my suggestion.
Thanks, Zach. And Sangeeta?
I think of the many things that are critical, the one I feel the maker or the breaker are the people, right? So hiring the right kind of team has been extremely crucial. So how do you hire for values beyond just the hard skills is a tough one, but one of the most critical ones for us. And we're looking at people who are not only able to understand what is being said, but are practicing deep listening, radical listening, right? For us to enable some of this. So that's a tougher one, but a significant.
Thanks, Sangeeta. And Anne?
Yeah, I love that. Hire the right people. You need people you can just huddle in the corner with and go, this isn't working. It's not working. What are we going to do? If you don't have those people, it's difficult. But I think I would say start small. If you have a reluctant board, start with something small, because you need to help them to understand, you know, that the risk here is really low, that nothing can really go wrong, but they're going to be concerned about that. And I think it's easier. This is obviously easier to do in some settings than others, but I think if you start small, then the risk is small. So if it's small amounts of money people are giving away, you know, even if it goes wrong, you haven't lost much. So that would be my advice: start small.
Thank you. If you have questions for our panel, we've got a lovely half an hour still together, so I'm hoping we can get to some really juicy questions. If you want to put them in the chat, that would be great, and I will do my best to facilitate them. Because I know Anne can't stay with us right until the end, I thought that we could come to Sharon Jones's question first. Sharon, do you want to come off mute and ask it out loud?
Yeah, hi. Sorry. Thanks, Anne. That was really helpful. I just wondered whether you had any conversations with your board about kind of the size of grant that the young grant makers could make, or whether that was an issue for them. Did that help kind of allay some of their concerns and risks?
Yeah, good point. So we're quite a small funder. And I think the first year I think the young people had about 70,000 to give away in total, but we didn't say you have to give this away in small amounts of money. The young people decided, and they, as you know, they nearly always limit that themselves because they want to give it to, you know, to many groups. I think if the young people had come back and said we want to give 70,000 to one group, that would have been a problem. But they didn't, you know, they came back with reasonable amounts. So I think, yeah, we only put in a small amount in the total pot, you know, relatively small amount in the total pot to start with. The issue we did have was the cost of, I should have said this really, the cost of giving away the money compared to the amount in the pot. So we employed, because it's a long-term program, our young grant makers, it's over 5-6 months. We employed a project worker to run it. So actually the cost of giving up that money was really expensive compared to the amount we were giving away. And our trustees did have a lot of concerns about that, and sort of still less so now, but we had to have that argument with them, I'd say, for 4 years before they were kind of didn't need to have that argument anymore. And, you know, I get it, it was the cost of another grant, you know, employing someone to do this. So yeah, that was part of their concern, I think.
Thanks, Anne. And Ben, you had a question for Anne and a question for Zach as well, I think. Anne, are you all right to stay for another few more minutes if Ben? Cool. Ben, are you all right to come off mute? Thank you.
Sure
Hello.
thing. Yeah, thank you. No, my basic question to Anne was essentially, did you have to navigate any legal complexities as you transferred this ownership and responsibility of the funds from the board to, yeah, the grant making teams?
Yeah, not really, because as long as our board basically agreed and had it minuted that a delegated authority up to a certain grant level was made to a team member, in this case me, that was fine. So I can't remember what our, maybe something like 30,000. I can't quite remember what it is now, but I have a limit to how much I can decide. Obviously I'm not deciding, but I kind of am on behalf of the board for those grants. But our auditors have always been fine with it, and as long as we minute everything. So occasionally we've been a bit, I must admit, over the years, a bit lax about reporting back some of the grants, and the auditors don't like that. They get very upset if there isn't a minute, you know, of the committee saying, yes, you've made these grants and we're happy with that. And I guess technically they are approving them. So, you know, it's something we don't, you know, it's just we don't let them make any changes. But I guess as a board, they are technically approving them because that's their responsibility to do. And as I say, they have the risk. And but that process has worked for us. And as I say, our auditors have been happy, which seems to be the main thing. We need to keep our auditors happy.
I live my
Thank
life
you.
to keep auditors happy. It's
Yes.
it's the reason I get out of bed in the morning. Ben, did you want to ask your question to Zach as well?
Oh, sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, Zach, I was just curious what it was like kind of bringing your team together and then the outreach to your community. What does that process look like? And yeah, highs, lows, success, failures there.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one we continue to grapple with of how, and I think it's the thing we're hoping to explore over the next year of what model do we really want to adopt for participatory grant making, and what level do we want to do that in? Do we want to do it, you know, at a really local community level? Do we want to keep it at the state level, which we're currently operating at? Do we want to do it, you know, identity based and have different grants, which are actually smaller amounts of funding, but for, you know, different types of partners. That's what we're in the process of trying to work out for ourselves right now. And I think the thing that we're trying to use as our North Star, and that are those values that we created. And that was its own process of multiple years, and really, I'd say, as most of those conversations started with, in a good way, an instigator in the organization, right? Someone who was willing to like ask the hard questions and stir things up a little. And that person, several years ago, right when I started at the food bank, actually, was the one who got us to have all staff engagement on a monthly basis, and unlocked that funding for a facilitation team to come in and help us start doing all staff conversations and trust building and learning as an organization. And we did that with a facilitating team for about 1.5 years. And then once that contract ended, we shifted to a staff-led model. We now actually, the diversity, equity, and inclusion team now facilitates those monthly meetings on a regular basis. And that team, when that shift from consultant to staff-led happened, was the impetus for these values and for this framework. We wanted to have something that we could lean into and own as an organization. And so we, you know, the first step was going back to one of those all staff meetings and having full team. We're about 70 folks at this point at the food bank, having a full team discussion around, you know, what does it mean to work here? What values do we want to hold? And where is our work headed? Collecting those thoughts, bringing it back to the smaller group, workshopping that into a draft, bringing the draft back to the whole staff, workshopping it some more, right? It was about a year-long process. And then once we had what felt like a more polished draft that we were ready to share, we then brought it to our board of directors and to our network for feedback. And I think it was then iterated slightly again from there. And then we just reviewed it after a year to look at it again. So, you know, it's always just like grant making, we're always looking back on it, reflecting, and making sure it still is where we want to be as an organization.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
And I know Anne is really keen to answer your question, but actually I think it's a potentially really interesting question to see how all three of you respond to it. So Trang, I don't know if you wanted to come off of mute to ask that question.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. So I suppose the question is really around limiting bias. So how are you limiting bias in the decision-making process from the community when you might have some groups that are larger than others, or you might have different levels of engagement or uneven engagement in certain groups, or you've got some more established communities versus, say, more emerging communities that are coming, particularly, let's say, refugees and stuff like that. So how are you ensuring that, obviously, limiting that bias in that process?
Anne, did you want to take it first? Because I know you've got to go.
Sure.
Like I'm trying to get rid of you. Sorry.
Yeah. So I do think that it's an ongoing tension around this kind of work in some ways. I think one of the things we say is that the people who join our resident panels are not, we think they're not there to represent everybody that lives in our borough. And they're not there to represent, so if they're young people, they don't come representing all young people in the borough. So therefore, obviously, the obligation is on us to recruit a diverse and mixed panel that come from different backgrounds, different communities and so forth. We've managed, I think we've been quite successful with our young grant makers, partly because we have more of them. So we have 12 in a cohort, so that gives us a bit more range and scope to do that. And we have, maybe because the program's a bit more established, I think we have different avenues that we can go to. So a lot of the groups that we fund, we will go to try and recruit. And we're consciously looking for people who wouldn't necessarily, come forward to do that kind of work. In some ways, I think that's a bit easier with young people, because I think there's a kind of process. Young people are used to that from school, and they're used to kind of, here's an opportunity, maybe I'll get involved. I think we've recently done our first panel for older people, and we came up with all kinds of different challenges, and frankly, that panel was not as diverse as we would have liked it to have been. We started off with quite a diverse panel, and then we lost some people. They didn't stay. So we're going to do it again this year. We learned an awful lot about that recruitment and about how to support some of those people on the panel, but it was quite different, I think, from our younger panel. So I don't think I have an answer to that apart from kind of work in progress, really.
I was going to say, I assume that technology would be one of those issues, but also, I mean, on the other side, and as an add to the question that I was saying, was also when there's language barriers in certain groups as well, and how you're kind of managing that.
Yeah, and obviously in somewhere like Central London, that's a big issue. We're trying to recruit from a whole range of communities, and language can be one of the issues. I'm not sure we do brilliantly at that, if I'm honest. Partly because we have not had a lot of people who don't have English or sufficient English coming to us. And that's probably our problem, because we're not going to those communities to engage properly. So I think that is a big, I think we're very aware of that being a gap. And actually with the older persons panel, we had a lot of people who had never done a kind of an office type job before. So they were not familiar really with agendas or with meetings so technology was one thing, but we met in person. So that was generally okay. But they were very thrown, a lot of them, because they hadn't had those kind of jobs before. And again, we got lots of learning for, how you sit down with a group of older people who've had, jobs driving trucks or working in shops or, and don't know what an icebreaker is. So I think there's a lot of, we learned lots from it, and we've now written a very long and informed learning paper, on which we will, happy to share with people, but also loads to think about for when we do it again. Yeah.
Thanks, Anne. And Sangeeta, you're working with such a different model in a much bigger place than Islington. I don't know how, do you have things to share about how you manage bias within that?
I was just thinking, I mean, it's a difficult one to answer for sure, because the sample itself is, like you're saying, diverse enough. But I think one of the ways for us to do this was actually constituting this investment committee. To bring in people from different perspectives is a starting point, and we have seen that this helps. And the other thing that we're seeing it helps is that while there could be different ways in you want to gauge the eligibility of that organization, right? We try to bring it back to the whole leadership, community centricity, and vulnerability, because that's what we are standardizing from everybody, for everybody across the cohort. So at least in the deliberations, the conversations that the investment committee is doing, if, for example, we see that there's a lot of conversation happening just on one facet, we try to bring in the others to make sure that some of that is kind of not lost in the process. But yeah, it's definitely not an easy one. I think there is learning there.
The art of unbiased facilitation is not an easy one. Zach, did you have any learnings to share on bias?
Yeah, I'll just say it's something we continue to grapple with too, and I think it's part of the reason why we are considering a possibility for next year where we have 2 smaller pots of money instead of one large pot, because we are a statewide organization, and our partners have such varying needs that I do have a hesitation of if we were to just take like a demographic representation of our network, and it is primarily traditional charitable food pantries, what will that group do, and what will they prioritize, and is that actually in alignment with like the Foodbank's values as an organization, and that tension. So it's one of the reasons we're considering potentially trying to create two smaller funds actually instead of one large fund, and capture everyone in that process. But I'll say I think we've done a decent job so far in that we don't do any, we try to stay neutral in our facilitation during the process. I don't do any sort of correcting in terms of prioritization in terms of geographic or type of partner during the process, but I do a lot of intentional outreach and sort of number crunching before and after to see if we're getting closer to where we want to be and less biased. So for example, the first year we did the grant program, we went through it, I didn't make any course correction. And then at the end, we looked at the data and we realized that because I do this work part-time and I also do community engagement in our community, in our county, most of the grant funding went to this county that I'm in, particularly more than any other county. I think it was just a side effect of I was the one facilitating the grant and engaging the community. And so if I went to a partner and said, oh, don't forget about that grant. If you have questions, give me a call. Whereas the other part of the state, they didn't have that resource. That was a big learning, right? Like that was like, oh, we didn't handle that especially equitably. And so that was a good learning moment for us to think about doing much more intentional outreach. You know, sort of as Sangeeta was saying ahead of time, if you have the right people in the room, then that bias is easier to manage throughout the process.
Thanks, Zach. Elena, I've seen you put something in the chat. Is that your question to Sangeeta?
Yes, it is. Hi,
Sorry, I
Sangeeta.
missed.
Yeah, I would just like to ask, how do you measure success if you talk about local community engagement? So you say that you really work on getting the members from the local community, however diverse they are, in program creation and delivery. So how involved are they actually? What do you consider success there?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question. And I remember doing a lot of back and forth on this before we arrived on what we thought would make sense. So what we are saying really is that we are not getting into a conversation of what the model is, or to say that we will support a specific kind of people, right? Because that's the idea. What we are trying to gauge is this across 3 levels. We are saying that there could be, in a spectrum, you could involve the community in different ways. And that would be a function of course, what are you trying to do and what is that end game. So what we really try to gauge at 3 levels, what we are saying the highest level of community involvement is where you are enabling leadership within the community to drive change, right? Because that's doing is that beyond the leaders and beyond the programs that you are running today, you are ensuring that sustainable change is what you are kind of doing after, and therefore that agency and awareness level and that leadership creation is kind of the gold standard. And that's again devoid of, irrespective of whichever model you are following. So that's where we rank them the highest, if that is the case. And what we try to do is not ask leading questions. So not to say that are you sort of enabling community leadership, but more like talk to us a little bit about what is your approach, how often do you talk to the communities, what happens in those conversations. So really trying to gauge through non-leading questions. So that's like the highest level of ownership for us. The second is where we see there is a lot of cases in which maybe due to different reasons, you may not be able to build that leadership today. However, you are ensuring that they are systematically involved, right? There is focus group discussions that you are doing, where you are including them in constant feedback loops, especially if you are a service delivery focused organization, right? So that again helps us give a sense of that while you may not be doing it today, it's somewhere in your horizon and you're working towards it. So that kind of becomes like the second category for us. And the last one is where it's sporadic. So either due to how they are doing it today or what their vision is, they are only involving the community in a way that is helping with a specific part in the process, but not the process. And we necessarily do not see that come out in their vision in terms of how they talk about the community's journey. So that's kind of the lowest level. So across these 3 levels, it gives us a sense of where the organization is, because again, I think there could be different ways that you look at it, but we try to keep away from the whole model conversation, but look at it from this involvement and engagement.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sangeeta, and thanks, Tracy, for what you've put in the chat about potentially putting together a step-by-step guide. I think there are some things on our website as well that we potentially could share in the chat, but it's a good idea to have a further chat about co-creating that in Slack or in the Google group. And if you're not in the Slack or the Google group, then email Elena and she'll point you in the right direction. Does anyone have any other questions for the panel? Feel free to hop off mute if you do, or put them in the chat.
I'm going to say goodbye, Tasha. You've been trying to get rid of me for about half an hour. I'm actually going to
Get
go
out,
now.
Anne. Thank you. Thanks for making time on a
It's really
busy day.
interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll use my prerogative then, because I would love to know, Sangeeta, how you're getting on with influencing the rest of the funding sector in India to be more trust-based, and where do you start with that and how's it going?
That's a great and the most uncomfortable question. I think we are again fairly early in the journey, but what we are doing is, because we have an anchor funder already who is put in a lot of trust in this, right? And we have a lot of funders that we saw, for example, came forward in very innovative ways during the COVID funding. So we are starting with that. And the idea really is that just how there is community champions, we are trying to create champions within the funders. So it's not about that you are hearing from Dasra, it's about you are hearing from one of your own. So that's kind of how we are doing that. The first 3 biggest influencers are kind of talking to their own set of peers. That's when we come in. That's when we try to have that conversation. So again, it's a long, it will take a longer period of time, but that's what we are.
Thank you. Anyone sitting on any questions? Don't be shy. I'll ask one final one then. This is the advantage I have. Zach, I love that you're doing participatory grant making, but you don't call yourself a foundation, and that you're also doing a delivery model. Do you think, from having done that, that brought you a different perspective on grant making to if you had been at a foundation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in some ways, like, Anne was saying, we started from a clean slate, right? Like, we didn't have any of the baggage. Even the discussion around like dealing with the trustees is really fascinating to me, because it's not a world I've ever had to swim in. Like, it wasn't even really a question of whether our board would have approval or not. It was just assumed that the staff, right, like the team making the decisions, would have the final authority, and it gets shared with the board, but they don't, like Anna was saying, the checks are out the door before it actually gets shared with them most of the time. So I think that is interesting. It's a different approach, and we're free of some of maybe the historical baggage of philanthropy. I think the other thing that we're hoping to grow into, that feels like an asset as a food bank, is we're already embedded in so many communities, because we have partners who are there doing distribution and have a very organic way of engaging with the people we're ultimately trying to have an impact with, or we're doing our own direct distribution of food to those communities. So we already have an organic outlet to have conversation and engagement with people across the state in a way that hopefully helps remove the potential, extractiveness of bringing folks in. Like, it really feels like a cooperative space that we can lean into. Thank you.
And we have more questions. Patty, do you want to?
Yes, hi. Just a quick one. I know that some of this was covered in the presentations, but if you had to choose like the one impact measurement that you look for when deciding like to give someone funding, what would it be?
That is a great question. That's why we have a scoring rubric with multiple questions on it, because it's really hard to narrow it down. I think, we ask multiple questions on the application about how folks are engaging their community and how they're listening to their community. And because we have such a wide network, we have some folks who are doing that very deeply, and we have some folks who that is brand new to them. And we fund both of them, but I think it always helps frame what type of support they might need other than just dollars in showing up. And I think that's sort of where we start the conversation with the review team.
Such a great question. Sangeeta, did you want to take it as well? What's your one metrics?
Yeah. So I think we have tried to break this down into 2 phases, right? So what we are saying is that before we are making the decision, we are not necessarily asking anything that's very impact specific, like I was saying. But however, because we have a sense of just how community centric you are, what we do is, once they are part of the portfolio, then we are saying that what is that one big thing that you need as an organization to enable change in the deepest format for you. So we leave it to them, but then it ties with what they are doing that we have a sense of. So that kind of helps.
Thank you both. That's really helpful.
Thanks, and thanks, Evan, for your question in the chat about we're quite signed up to participatory grant making, funnily enough, within the participatory grant making community of practice, although there might be someone sitting here as a spy, but how do we advocate for it and convince people that it has got some impact and evidence around it? In London, Pro Bono Economics have been doing some work to look at how to evidence participatory grant making as a model, and I think there have been some chats and sessions. Eleanor, is there a session on that's on the YouTube channel?
I think so. Yeah, I think there is.
So
Yeah.
too. So it might be worth joining that, picking that up, Evan, and seeing if there's anything you can take from that. But I don't know if in the final moments, Sangeeta or Zach, you've got anything to share about how you're evidencing why you're doing participatory grant making.
At least in our context, like I said, that we are trying to, this is in a way that proof of concept, right? So hopefully what we do helps create evidence for others. But I think what we have done is, at least pre-COVID, a lot of grant makers, whatever they were doing, we tried to use different bits and pieces of that information, which is publicly available. Some of those are publicly available. Some of those you may not find. But there is not a one-stop solution evidence in that way yet, at least in our context. So it's really about you have to pick and choose basis. Who is your audience? What is it that you want to talk about? But yeah, that's, I think, majority of the case. But again, through at least our hope is that through more models like this evidence gets created as well.
Thank you. And Zach?
Yeah, I similarly, it's a little bit of a catch-22, right? Because I think it builds on itself. And I think for me, the most compelling, and I shared our journey, right? We are definitely moving towards more and more participatory. We didn't start there. And I think the most compelling piece of that is each year as we go along, we get more and more feedback, both from applicants and recipients and from our own staff, of how meaningful a process it is. You know, even for staff who aren't involved at any other point in the process, to be able to come into the room and read applications and hear from other people throughout the state of why that partner is doing impactful work and what it means in their community, that's led to a lot of growth and enjoyment, I think, among our staff. So they've sort of helped build the case for me. Actually, I have like a network that I'm of advocates that I'm building at the organization. Yeah.
Thank you. The thing that always feels worth saying is the fact that in Vermont there's needed to be a network of food banks is perhaps a good illustration that traditional philanthropy models are not doing what they need to do. So something else is needed. With 4 minutes to go, thank you so much, Sangeeta, and thank you so much, Zach, for sharing so honestly everything. I found it really, really helpful. I'm sure that others have as well. Before we go, I will share the feedback QR code. I hope. There we go. Feedback is always really, really useful for the community and working out what we do. But I think at this point where we're 3 years old and we're particularly at a point trying to work out how we can support people that might be newer to participatory grant making, but also supporting people that have been doing it for years and need something else in their practice. If you've never given feedback before to us, we'd really, really love today to be the day that you do it, because it's always listened to, but I think at the moment we're particularly wanting to listen from people about what they need and want from the community. So if you can, the session was free, but if in return you can grant us a little bit of understanding about why you're in the community and what your big hopes for the community are, that would be incredibly, incredibly useful to us. So thank you very much. And I will wrap up and just say thank you again to Zach and Sangeeta and Anne, who's left us, and to Elena for making everything work. And I hope to see you all soon at some other webinar or in real life. Bye.
Thank you.